Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Friday seminar series. I'm Laura Rosick. I direct the Center for Southeast Asian Studies here at the University of Michigan, and we're very happy to have you here today for another great lecture in our series. Today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, the School of Music, Theater, and Dance, and the International Institute, and supported with funding from the U.S. Department of Education National Resource Center, for which we are grateful. And before we go on to some of our events for the next few weeks, I just wanted to quickly acknowledge some of the events that happened this week in Atlanta with the tragic violence against Asian American women. And just acknowledge that CEAS, of course, is following information and denounces any kind of violence, especially on the background of so much racism against Asian Americans this year. And with the unrelated events in Southeast Asia that continue to happen, and the horrific violence in Myanmar and other parts of Southeast Asia, but Myanmar especially, and that we stand in solidarity with all Asian Americans and Asians, and hope that you're able to visit the CEAS website or the International Institute's website if you would like to find some resources where you can discuss this with other members of our community. We have a few upcoming events I'd like to highlight. The Donia Human Rights Center discussion on shared sovereignty and accountability in fragile states. This event will feature discussions of sovereignty sharing in fragile states. And this is a new book by John Chiricari, one of our faculty who's at the Ford School of Public Policy. He'll be in conversation with Professor Susanna Campbell of American University. She's an expert on peace building and international interventions. Dr. Chiricari will share findings from his book. He's going to be outlining conditions under which shared sovereignty tends to fail or succeed in advancing accountability for human rights violations. And we know that this will be a great event. The registration is here, and please attend. Our next CEAS lecture will be Friday, April 2nd, 2021. We're really happy to welcome Professor Alquist from Michigan State University, talking about ruptured ecologies, how Thai settler colonialism is reshaping the northern uplands and indigenous futures. We're really happy to invite him as we start to build some more bridges with our Southeast Asian faculty and friends at Michigan State University. So please register and attend that. And then today, we're really happy and excited to welcome back Dr. Alexander M. Cannon. He's a lecturer in music at the University of Birmingham, where he teaches classes in ethnomusicology, critical musicology, and the traditional musics of Asia. And he further serves as the co-editor of the Ethnomusicology Forum, the Journal of the British Forum for Ethnomusicology, and sits on the BFE committee. He's an alumnus, as I mentioned, of the University of Michigan. He has his MA and PhD in ethnomusicology from the School of Music, Theater, and Dance here, where he wrote his dissertation on the Southern Vietnamese traditional music genre, Dun Ca Tai Tu, music of talented amateurs. With apologies again for my pronunciation. Those of you who come frequently know that it's not great usually. He's recently completed a book manuscript, congratulations on that, titled Seeding the Tradition, Musical Creativity in Southern Vietnam. And he also has an article in the most recent issue of the journal Ethnomusicology. This is titled Awakening the Soul with the Left Hand, Narration and Healing in Vietnam's Diasporic Traditional Music. He's published in Ethnomusicology, Ethnomusicology Forum, Asian Music, and the Journal of Vietnamese Studies, which is where you can go if you're interested after this talk in some of his further scholarship. For our discussion today, we're really happy to, again, welcome back Dr. Christiane Castro, who was the director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies for, I think, 8 years. She is an associate professor and the chair of musicology at the School of Music, Theater, and Dance at the University of Michigan. And her area of research includes music of the Philippines, nationalism, music, and health, and Asian American music making. We're really happy to have her back and to facilitate the discussion after the talk. So with that, Professor Cannon, please begin. And again, welcome virtually to Michigan.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. I too actually would like to start with an acknowledgement of the violence that we have seen over this past week in Greater Atlanta that included the targeting of women of Asian ancestry and in Myanmar against unarmed protesters. And by no means are these the only incidents. It sometimes can seem incongruous to take part in the exercises of the ivory tower when such deeply unsettling events occur. But at the very least, these events need to be kept in our minds so we redouble our efforts to combat the injustice of the world and make sure we actively take part in creating supportive networks, especially for younger and marginalized scholars to do their work. To that end, then, I hope that you find support and comfort in the Center for Southeast Asian Studies community. I certainly did when I was a student there, and that you will all continue to find the support where and when you need it. In addition to those based at U of M, the center has an extensive alumni network to which I belong. So please call on us to extend whatever support and guidance we can. We may never have met, but we, you and I, are connected in this virtual space, renewing community through sound. And with this, I will get started with my talk on listening. Several years ago, I attended the keynote address of a senior scholar of Asian music, whose primary argument was that young people have abandoned traditional music. This argument certainly is not limited to one speaker, but I use this instance as an example of the logic deployed by similar advocates. The lecture began with a description of traditional music from a particular Asian nation as historically heterogeneous, but at some point in its history, the practice became homogeneous. Traditional music became more fixed. Following the importation of Western ideas, music in the nation started to develop more quickly, and there emerged a need to preserve these homogeneous traditions. The speaker then turned to the most beautiful genre of traditional music of the nation, left unappreciated by young people, and it required such preservation. This puzzled me. The speaker invoked an inexact description of historical transformation from the heterogeneous to the homogeneous at some point in the past, but also used their position of authority as a strategy to further homogenize this single tradition as the most beautiful. Western influence was not critiqued here, but instead the speaker blamed young people for not taking enough interest. Evidence of this apathy was taken selectively from message boards, online message boards, and the author conducted no interviews with young people to corroborate the claim. Yet the speaker still concluded, would it not be a tragedy for young people to allow this beautiful music to die? State policymakers, diplomats, and academics similarly scapegoat an amorphous and not easy to define group of individuals. It's easier to blame young people than to reflect on the devastating colonial and imperialist histories of Asia and reflect on the power senior scholars and officials deploy to shape tradition as they see fit. Young people have far more nuanced understandings of traditional music than scholars give them credit. I spoke with a young Vietnamese friend about this lecture a few days after it happened, and he immediately honed in on the heterogeneous versus homogeneous argument. Traditional music has factions, he said, but the same most likely is true in the country referenced by the academic I mentioned earlier. Traditional music constantly splits into new scenes of practice. Tradition is not static at all, but dynamic and part and parcel of modernization. A conversation with another friend on this topic touched a nerve in him, and he expressed a particular irritation with being blamed for destroying the traditional arts. Referring to two genres of Southern Vietnamese traditional music, Đơn Ca Tài Tử, music for diversion, and Cải Lương, renovated theater music, he indicated that both live on in youth culture, but in a different sense than in the past. Young people mix dankataitu and kailuang tunes into vaporwave, the internet-based microgenre, into trap remixes on YouTube, and into hip-hop remixes featured on television programs. These artists spend time listening to and drawing on an extensive online archive of traditional music to use older tunes creatively and strategically. My friend pointed out too that films were being used to tell stories of great interest to young people. In particular, he mentioned the film Lắng, which I will examine later in this lecture. What struck me as vitally important in my last friend's comments was the emphasis on listening. Young people listen to music created in the past, and they teach what they have learned in their musical outputs. Films like Lắng amplify this work, teaching audiences how to listen to and understand traditional music. The senior scholar quoted above, on the other hand, was not listening, or only listened selectively to support their prefabricated claims. My lecture here focuses then on the listening experience, particularly how young people listen, identify listening processes, and teach these processes. I make reference to the Vietnamese term for listening, Lắng, nghe, as artists deploy it in their work. Indeed, artists ask us to listen, not just to hear, but to understand what we hear in the work that they disseminate to audiences. Tradition might be tested here, but it does not die. Approaching how audiences listen to the communicative properties of music is not a new endeavor in ethnomusicology. John Blacking, Jean-Jacques Nattier, and Thomas Torino, for instance, have evaluated the potential use of semiotics to understand meaning-making in music. In graduate school, I was particularly enamored with Stephen Feld's 1984 article, Communication, Music, and Speech About Music, where he proposes the 5 listeners' interpretive moves. Listeners interpret locationally, categorically, associationally, reflectively, and evaluatively. This allows for engagement with the structures of power through which listeners listen, what they adopt from a corpus of banked and normative knowledge, and how they might inject their own agency into the listening experience. Although still a relevant work in many ways, contemporary ethnomusicology will take issue with the supposition that the listening experience is, for Feld, quote, the juxtaposition of a dialectical object and a consumer, end quote. Putting the capitalist enterprise of consumption aside for now, we're not listening to objects, dialectical or not. We're listening to snippets of processes from agents, human, material, or otherwise, who have a stake in shaping this meaning. The listening experience is more dynamic and involves 2 agents of shifting positionality, if not more. As listeners, how do we change the processes of engagement by our very presence? And how do these processes change us? History also plays a role in listening. How sounds resounded in the past and how these resoundings are carried forward to the ear today. J. Martin Doherty offers the term acoustic palimpsest in a 2013 article in Music and Politics as a concept, quote, to foreground the multiple acts of erasure, effacement, occupation, displacement, collaboration, and reinscription that are embedded in music composition, performance, and recording, as well as in acoustic experience more broadly, end quote. Viewing the listening experience as akin to reading the palimpsest, the ethnomusicologist undertakes a kind of layered listening to understand what is behind the layers of meaning in sound resounding. In some ways, this is akin to a Bakhtinian analysis of the many voices of musical text, and although a worthwhile endeavor, it is not my goal here either. I am more concerned with the intersection of what musicians and audiences understand as the traditional Vietnamese truyền thống and modern hiện đại, as indexed by genres of traditional and popular music, respectively. How have listening practices associated with these 2 concepts been shaped in the past 100 years? How have particular texts and value systems taken part in shaping what it means to listen traditionally? To answer these questions, I take many cues from Ana Maria Ochoa Gautier's 2014 work, Orality, in which she traces the way that the oral and the oral in Colombia have been shaped and disciplined by colonization, the written word, and more generally, modernity. And I quote from her here, quote, "The identification of orality and tradition as autonomous spheres of knowledge within the epistemic domain of language has historically been a major technique of the construction of modernity and of the social inequalities within it. An aesthetic technique and disciplinary domain, orality, that contrasted with lettered elites' use of spoken and written language, and the constitution of a particular temporality, tradition as the complementary and constitutive other of modernity, became a modern paradigm for the identification of alterity within modernity itself." In other words, alterity here is the thing, i.e. tradition, different from the modern but necessary for its creation. The creation of a field of orality generated a theory and methodology for lettered elites to generate a notion of alterity as constitutive of the modern, end quote. If the modern created tradition, shaped tradition, and fixed forms of listening in the past, can the dynamism of tradition reemerge as a concept not regimented by modernity? I argue that it can, and it has, in various popular music and other musical formats in contemporary Vietnam. The artists who create them, too, advocate for a revised form of listening, where the modern becomes the alterity of tradition and tradition disciplines the modern. Lắng nghe means listening. And while it can have relatively innocuous meaning as it does in English, it is not passive listening. Like Ochoa Gautier's description, Lắng nghe is a kind of orality where a producer of sound, Vietnamese âm thanh, communicates something or weaves intent into the sound, so it will be understood in a particular way. It brings the sound producer and the receiver into a kind of exchange. The producer intends and the receiver hears and uses their interpretive faculties to understand that intent. There is the possibility of slippage here. So to prevent miscommunication, both producer and receiver need to be trained in how to listen to each other. Lắng nghe therefore requires practice. Governments know this just as well as musicians do. And indeed, governments expend great energy in shaping how its population listens. Receivers are interpolated into listening. Here I'm drawing on Louis Althusser's term interpolation to mean how we're indoctrinated or brought into ideology so we interpret what we hear in specific ways. Vietnamese school children, as well as British and American school children, are taught to understand what they are told. Don't hit your classmate or do open the door for others. But they're also taught to distinguish timbre. So children know when they've done something wrong. They're taught to pronounce terms properly, which is especially fraught in southern Vietnam, where teachers correct the thick Mekong Delta accent in schools, so kids speak the proper Vietnamese. They're taught to feel a sense of pride when they hear of the accomplishments of their nation, etc. For those familiar with the history of Vietnam immediately after 1975, or if you've read Viet Thanh Nguyen's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Sympathizer, you will know that the victorious Communist Party set up re-education camps to teach former citizens of the Republic of Vietnam how to become good citizens and good listeners of the new regime. There was, of course, a violent and putative element of this as well. By obeying commands, singing revolutionary songs, and reciting the morals of Ho Chi Minh, the camps attempted to reteach these individuals how to speak and how to listen. But people also have agency, putting aside what they're supposed to do in favor of something more poignant. Children frequently play games with how they are taught to listen, often relishing in the reactions they receive when they do not respond as they are supposed to respond. Those who emerged from the re-education camps did not have new ears. They understood the new rules of how to interpret sounds, but the violence they experienced remained ever present in their memories alongside those new sounds. Everyday listening became repeated trauma, and many sought to escape from Vietnam to survive. Musicians operate in similar ways. In traditional music circles of southern Vietnam, they study with multiple teachers of multiple instruments to understand what they're supposed to do, but they also learn how to experiment and generate spontaneous responses to what they hear. In the genre of music on which I have written most extensively, musicians get together in cafes at night or in private homes at midday, drawing on the musical modes and other structures that they've learned over the course of their lives. And then they improvise new content for that setting. They listen to one another and the stories told through melody and rhythm, and generate something meaningful together. Social solidarity and comfort emerge in these spaces, and while sung text is present, the most meaningful parts of the performance happen through sound, where each individual is free to interpret the sound produced. Popular music in Vietnam increasingly has drawn on these methods of generating meaning, and while the hits produced are not improvised, they do experiment with meaning making through sound. These hits occasionally index traditional music through the use of Vietnamese instruments, but they do not have to do so. The popular then becomes a form through which the tradition lives. To provide evidence of this, I start with Bet On Me, a tune by the rapper Suboy, released in December 2019. I'll play the video in just a minute, but I'll describe what we hear at the start before playing it. Towards the beginning of the track, we hear a danchain zither playing a series of glissandi, as if transporting us back in time to her departure to the countryside. So at the beginning, she is in the countryside and she's sort of thinking about her time in the city, and the sound of the zither sort of transports us between these two spaces. This gives way to an electric guitar with a good deal of added reverb. It may sound completely modern to our ears, but Vietnamese traditional music can be played on the electric guitar, suggesting that traditional music is not completely absent from the narrative she presents. We then see her husband tying a red string on her hand, and we get a close-up of the Saigon beer tattoo on her arm. We are clear then that at this stage in the music video, she's in Saigon, renamed now Ho Chi Minh City, a city that has been increasingly featured in her music videos as of late. With a slightly abrupt transition, we hear the chorus. Baby, I knock on noi, bet on me. So she talks about how you don't need to say anything. Presumably she's talking to her husband or her lover at this point, although she is pregnant in the music video. And so there's an assumption that maybe she's also talking to her baby. You don't need to say anything. Listen to my heart. And she says, Lắng nghe, twice here. And then this comes up later in the music video as well. So now let me turn to this so we can listen to this track.
Baby, đâu cần nói bet on me. Giờ tôi vui như chim bao, baby, đâu cần nói lắng nghe trái tim em. Giờ tôi vui như chim bao, baby, đâu cần nói bet on me. Giờ tôi vui như chim bao, baby, đâu cần nói lắng nghe trái tim em. Giờ tôi vui như chim bao, baby, đâu cần nói bet on me. Giờ tôi vui như chim bao, baby, đâu cần nói lắng nghe trái tim em. Giờ tôi vui như chim bao, baby, đâu cần nói.
So at the start here, there's a linguistic clarity as well as a bit of ambiguity, but this is typical of Suboy's lyrics. There are multiple ways of understanding what she is saying. I'm not going to say a great deal here about the lyrics, but she refers to her husband, Nodi, who's an accomplished Franco-Vietnamese DJ, and her baby. And she's encouraging listening here. Listen to and trust her heart. Indeed, that sound of her heart is all that the unborn child can trust. But there's a lot more going on here sonically. This work was produced in 2019 when there remained a resurgent interest in 1980s synth music, especially with the popularity of the Netflix series Stranger Things. And so she's engaging with cosmopolitan English language popular culture that would have been popular in Ho Chi Minh City during this time period. And indeed, at the end of most of these lines, there's a short synth melodic riff playing in counterpoint to her melodic line. However, once she gets on her motorbike in the video and sets off for the countryside, those melodic counterpoints disappear, and we only hear a single pitch playing eighth notes, as if to stagnate the forward motion of the narrative or make it seem more dreamlike. So I'll go back and play a little bit of that again.
Baby, anh đâu cần nói. Lắng nghe trái tim em. Tôi vui như chim bao. Baby, anh đâu cần nói.
When she gets outside of the city, she smiles, and we again hear the return of the Denchine zither, this time playing a repeating pentatonic motive. The road clears, and she starts to climb up into the hills of Tuihua, where it was filmed, or this music video was filmed. Audience members listen to the zither as accompaniment to the lush green coconut trees. During much of this, she's either singing Lange Chaitim Mem or Lange, 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 as if calling out to the audience to listen to the sounds she has weaved into the narrative. I offer two brief conclusions from these evaluations. First, Suboy and her team bring the traditional and modern to a clear point of intersection. Even with the use of the synthesizer and visual depictions of a modern Saigon, tradition remains clearly relevant to the production of narrative. We hear this sonically with the incorporation of the Danchine zither at the start and later when she tells us to Lange. Visually, we not only see images of the countryside, but she places these sites in frame with the modern. Secondly, Suboy suggests to us that knowledge emerges through listening rather than saying something. We just need to listen to our hearts. I do not interpret this as some trite pop filler text. Indeed, she's saying rather explicitly that if we listen to sound, our hearts will be moved. In a context where words can mean trouble, sound communicates outside of language to express long-standing sonic sentiments, and these sentiments connect people. Lange listening, therefore, is meant to move us or create some kind of response in us. It can even be understood as advocating a kind of subtle activism. For instance, in newspaper articles that advocate listening to music that discuss the dangers of climate change. So Lange is used in these articles to talk about activism. Suboy's messages do not simply emerge from one track, but from links of tracks. So it's important to consider messages across her corpus of output. If we evaluate these works over time, we see that she has been teaching audiences to listen in new ways for a few years already. She encourages us, for instance, to listen to her southernness, her unapologetically Saigonese identity manifested in visual depictions of Ho Chi Minh City street life and in her accent. This is subtle but quite powerful. Suboy emerged quite young on the popular music scene rapping as a teenager, and she initially sang using the Northern Vietnamese accent. Even if singers grew up in Central or Southern Vietnam, they use the Northern accent as standard, if only to make sure that everyone who listened could understand. The Hanoi dialect, the Northern dialect, is found on television, in official speeches, and in music, so it's assumed that everyone will understand it. The local dialects are more difficult to understand across the entire country. She's moving away from this practice, however. Before the release of Bet On Me, two previous tracks, En Sao, released in August 2018, and Gum, released in December 2018, help craft a message of Southernness, a distinct listening position carved out through sound and language. Early in En Sao, she raps of sitting on the street, drinking beer and singing, using the Southern dialect term đơn ca rather than đàn ca to depict the act of listening. In Gom, she employs accent code switching as a form of commentary. The track depicts the toxic culture of Saigon show business, where cookie cutter singers turn out the same kinds of tunes, and how hard work goes unrewarded. At the start of the song, she describes the local scene and complains to a sympathetic audience in the Saigonese accent. This culminates in a passage where she sings, "Đưa cho người ta công bằng ngày qua là ra xong." Do the work, give them your labor, for them just to pass it over and throw it into the river, presumably the Saigon River. I'll play the start of this track leading up to this particular line so you can hear it in context.
I'm a young Vietnamese lady, who's this? Who's this? I'm a young Vietnamese lady, who's this? I don't. Real Saigonese pop show best don't fit. 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 Công việc không nó cũng bình thường, cộng với tình bạn nó tốt hơn. Công việc xong mỗi thằng một đường, công mà với bạn 100 chương, công mà thêm chấm là ốc. Công việc không cấm người xung phong, công việc cuối tháng là thêm phong bì. Công đưa cho người ta là ra xong, đưa cho người ta công bằng ngày qua là ra xong, đưa cho người ta công bằng ngày qua là ra xong, đưa cho người ta công bằng ngày qua là ra xong, đưa cho người ta công bằng ngày qua. No, I don't need no.
She repeats this line 4 times, so we get the message. Note here too that she sets up a call and response. The call, đưa cho người ta công bằng ngày qua, is rhythmically uneven and requires a clear rap flow to emerge, and it seems incomplete without the definitive response, la ra xong. She later sings directly to members of the toxic scene in sound and language of their world. She uses the standard Northern accent. She sings a relatively even melodic line, and the backing track is not as rhythmically dense and driving as earlier, as if she really is sonically trying to craft a different world. I should say as well that there are 1 or 2 swear words in this in English, so you can prepare yourself for those.
But I ain't give up, homies. You got your word, I got my word. We'll never judge you on me. When you get high on your ego, oh, and get tired, people. Cause I don't need no title to read the Bible, just trying to be a light, yo. Ngày nào mà có đường bay xa, mà lại không nhớ ngày hôm qua. Nhìn người nhiều quá, nhiều người làm quá, nụ cười rồi mà phá ngày đêm ra. Nhưng sao không sống ngày hôm nay, mà làm bạn với còng 2 tay. Nhìn người nhiều quá, nhiều người làm quá, nụ cười rồi mà phá ngày đêm ra.
So that passage that I just played, that was in the sort of more standard Northern or Hanoi dialect, as if she's speaking directly to the people who create this toxic culture. There isn't a great deal to read between the lines here. She questions the approach to career made by these unnamed celebrities, and she does so in the language of their world. She follows this section with a passage that asks us again to listen to her Southernness. She sings of the controlling nature of the music scene and how her work proves that she's a real Saigonese.
Nói nhiều càng ít, làm càng chán càng, kiểm soát càng mất kiểm soát, càng nói nhiều càng ít, làm càng chán càng, kiểm soát càng mất kiểm soát. I'm a young Vietnamese lady, who's this? 25 for life, not a cookie cutter bitch. The more they SCMC, the good thing is a real Saigonese pop show best don't fit. I'm a young Vietnamese lady, who's this? 25 for life.
I've discussed 3 songs by a major Vietnamese pop star. So some of you may be wondering where traditional music falls into all of this. To my ears and to the ears of friends that I mentioned at the start, these tracks emerge with meaning making in ways traditional musicians do as well. Southern Vietnamese music opens up opportunities to reflect, provide commentary, and offer solace through sound. Suboi encourages audiences to listen to music in this way, rather than simply accepting what we hear on the surface as fact. What has been especially interesting to watch over the past decade are the attempts to take popularized methods of distributing music and redeploy them to generate interest in traditional music. The traditional then becomes a form engaged with the popular and through which the popular lives. I offer 2 examples of this work. The first is an American Idol game show, American Idol style game show titled Tai Tu Miet Yuen, Countryside Amateur, that aired on Dong Tap Television in 2018 and 2019, and now lives on YouTube, where the network has uploaded full episodes and clips. The program stands out for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's widely popular, with full episodes reaching hundreds of thousands of listeners, and a number of clips reaching many millions of views, including one very popular clip that has reached 9 million views. No program of traditional music is this popular. Secondly, the performers appeared to perform live on stage. They were not lip syncing, which is typical in performances made for television in Vietnam. Thirdly, the television station seeks to relay unvarnished stories of the difficulties faced by ordinary people in the Mekong Delta. The station does relay a clear narrative, occasionally having contestants appear twice on the program, the first in more ordinary clothing and the second time in fancier clothes, as if the program has raised their spirits. So there is a narrative that's being shaped by the television station. But still, many of these stories are quite unvarnished. Some contestants feature prominent political themes by talking to the strength of the party and the outstanding morals of Chairman Ho Chi Minh, but those are relatively few and far between. Other performances feature charismatic and comedic individuals with an ability to shape sound and text into highly entertaining performances. Still, other performances feature shy singers who shine brightly when presenting powerful iterations of sadness and melancholy. I present one example here of Nguyen Ngọc Quỳnh Trân, a visually impaired singer from Ho Chi Minh City who appeared on the program in July and September 2018. I show an image here of her first performance, which elicited praise from one judge, Thanh Hang, who commented on the contestants' ability to ornament and elevate the text. The emotion that she brought to the performance caused another judge, Viet An, to cry during the judging commentary. On Nguyen Ngọc Quỳnh Trân's return to the stage, she sang Yan Tiên Tương, one of the saddest tunes in the Đơn Ca Tài Tử Cai Luang repertory. With just over 2 million views, the clip is popular, although not as popular as some others. The works presented in this clip and elsewhere in this program are not that long, only a few minutes rather than the 20 or 30 minutes as one might find elsewhere in the Mekong Delta. But audiences are trained to listen to how musicians and singer interact and work together to shape an emotional performance. And the commentary provided by the judging panel generates these understandings. In her commentary after the performance, Tan Hang again complimented the artist, noting in particular the singer's very effective articulation of specific tones of the Vietnamese language, which added a depth to the message that she presented. The second example that I present is the Vietnamese film Lắng, released in 2018. It is named for the wooden clapper found in Southern Vietnamese traditional music. This is the Lắng, if you can see it. The film revolves around two men, Yong, who is a debt collector for a loan shark, and a Kai Luong star named Linh Phong, who works for a theater company from whom Yong tried to collect a debt at the start of the film. The two grow very close, and the director Leon Le indicates that this closeness is meant to be romantically intimate, although physical intimacy is never shown on screen. The narrative of intimacy emerges early in the film before the two men spend much time together. In one scene, Linh Phong rehearses the final scene of a new production, a new Kai Luong production. Here, he holds his dying co-star in his arms and mourns her death. The performance seemed good enough to the film's audience, but when Linh Phong asks his voice teacher for commentary after the scene ends, the teacher suggests that Linh Phong's heart is not in the performance. I hear that your technique is better and more interesting, but you still lack this, and he points to Linh Phong's heart. Without the heart, you're not there yet. Linh Phong's co-star jokes that he's doing a good job for someone who has never fallen in love, so the teacher provides a solution. Yêu đi con, có yêu có mất rồi thì mày không diễn cũng ra à. You must fall in love. If you find love and then lose it, you won't need to act, i.e. you don't need to act on stage because you feel it. The co-star then looks at Linh Phong and asks, nghe chưa? In this context, it means, do you understand yet? But literally means, do you hear yet? This establishes the narrative for a budding intimacy. We first get a clue of it from Yong. Yong attends the first performance of the Kai Luong theater production and watches Linh Phong. On his return home, he turns on the radio to hear a recording of Linh Phong singing. He almost turns it off, but decides to listen. And the viewing audience starts to understand how Yong might be drawn to Linh Phong through his voice. He's not drawn through conversation or physical contact, but through a song and a voice on the radio. Although here too, Yong seems to be disappointed with the recording, as if something here is also missing. I'll skip ahead to the scene that solidifies their intimacy through sound. Here, Linh Phong opens a book in Yong's apartment, and a sheet of music or a sheet of lyrics falls out. Yong's deceased father wrote the lyrics. They're addressed to Yong's mother, who left them. After opportunities for Kai Luong artists started to dry up in the late 1970s and early 80s, she fled Saigon by boat, hoping to reach the United States, and she ultimately does. Yong asks Linh Phong to sing the lyrics. Linh Phong scoffs, indicating that he cannot sing unaccompanied. It would sound incomplete. Yong offers to accompany him on the moon-shaped lute Dan Kim. This comes as a surprise to Linh Phong, as he did not know that Yong could play. They play the tune Cheung Tung Tu. This is a tune in the Wan mode, which is known for its musical construction of profound sadness. The lyrics place the listener in a particular time and place, in this case at the end of autumn, with a degree of exactitude with which musicians also speak when describing how improvised sounds place listeners in specific times and places. The lyrics tell of only being able to relay the sorrow one feels through the sounds of the instrument, late into the evening, as the Sing remembers the shock of discovering his loved one had departed. Like the sound of the song Lắng, the singer keeps moving forwards, the lyrics say, waiting for the moment when they will be reunited. As I begin this clip, pay attention to how the scene is framed as well. We see Yum open his instrument case and run his hands along the dan kim. This suggests that we are entering a world created through sound.
Cài.
Thôi, tự nhiên bắt ca.
Cài thử coi.
Thôi, ca không có đàn nghe kỳ lắm.
Ngày cuối thu âm u cơn gió bấc, nhận được tin người mà tất giả tay tây. Nghĩa trăm năm tôi luôn son sắc một lời thề, sao nỡ để tôi phải ê chề trong ngao ngang. Giữa đêm khuya tiếng đàn nghe ai quán dằn cung sầu cống sự hò sang. Nhớ ai thức trăng cả canh ngàn, bàng hoàng ngỡ ngàng nơi phương trời xa thẳm. Nỗi nhớ người có còn nặng mang. Trăng dẫu sáng nhưng đâu soi thấu nỗi tâm can. Như tiếng đàn tôi nghẹn ngào nức nở oán than, cho một khối sầu ly tan. Nhịp sông Lắng tôi vẫn giữ âm thầm giữa cuộc sống đa đoan. Chờ đợi buổi tương quan nối lại đá vàng hàng răng.
In this example, we witness flashbacks from Yum's memory, a time when father and son bonded whilst trying to come to terms with abandonment. But in this memory, we learn how Yum learned to listen as well. We see his father playing the moon-shaped lute and Yum holding the song Lắng wooden clapper. He learns where to properly place the beat of the song Lắng. This indicates that he has a knowledge of listening, how to understand what is being played and anticipate the placement of the beat. We receive a smile from the younger Yum, while the older one looks stoic. These two men orient towards one another in shifting ways over the course of the film. The relationship that unfolds on the screen unfolds through sound, through listening. As an audience, we learn just what is possible through sound, through a traditional music with a long history in southern Vietnam. And the film suggests that sound continues to have profound relevance in the making of the human in contemporary Vietnam. The popular film frames the traditional, again reducing the distance between a modern present and practices of tradition. By way of brief conclusion, I have tried in this lecture to foreground sound and the ways that traditional music works alongside popular music to teach audiences the communicative power of sound and music. These works are driven by young people. Contrary to what newspapers or academics say, they are fully conversant in the knowledge imparted through traditional music. Thank you very much.
Alex, thank you so much for this rich talk and for sharing your work with us. We already have a question online for you. So let me just read it. It's in two parts. I'll just read the first part and then we can get to the second. From Mercedes, your choice to use listening through which to explore in which young people in Vietnam deploy traditional genres, but remake them according to their own listening experience. I understand that language and accents are the main vectors of difference through which songs building on traditional genres are made. You also mentioned Southernness. So my question is, what constitutes Southernness as an aesthetic sensibility, to borrow from Feld, aside from linguistic accent and the Southern Vietnamese experience vis-a-vis the North? What can you say is the primary aesthetic sensibility which singers emphasize in their music based on traditional songs and genres?
Thank you so much, Mercedes, for giving me a very difficult question to start out with. What constitutes Southernness as an aesthetic sensibility aside from linguistic accent and the Southern Vietnamese experience vis-a-vis the North? So I think there are a couple of things. One is sort of the sound of the instruments themselves and the way that they are played. You know, there are a lot of different layers that I could have gone into here. For example, the way of playing the zither, for instance, differs in the South than it does in the North. And you can hear that if you are an attuned listener. The reference to the instrument in the film Song Lắng, that's called the Dan Kim, as opposed to the Dan Nguyệt in the North. So, you know, there is, I guess that's more of a linguistic difference, but there are different ways of playing the Dan Kim Mun Sep lute. The other thing has to do with Southern Vietnamese modality. The two pieces that I played for you at the end, Yen Dien Tuong and the piece that I just played for you in Song Lắng, are both part of the Wan mode, which is not found elsewhere in Vietnam. It's only found in the South. And it's understood as a coming together of Vietnamese musical aesthetics, as well as Khmer and Cham musical aesthetics. There's actually a theory that sort of Cham modes from the what's now the Central Vietnamese coast influenced the production of the Wan mode, or the emergence of the Wan mode. And so there is this quite different music that is emergent through modality, that the musicians are strategically drawing upon to generate this sense of Southernness. Now, Suboi is a little bit different because there aren't as many connections to traditional music in that one. And so her sort of understanding of Southernness has to do with accent more, although accent, you know, is musical as well. The way that she is articulating particular words, you know, saying "yeah" as opposed to "vua," for instance, you know, and sometimes the way that words kind of blend together and the way that they're spoken in the Saigonese accent. I mean, these are also, I think, part of a non-linguistic aesthetic sensibility.
And I should say that Mercedes Junco is faculty at Yunnan University. You know, she does not let you off the hook on the second question either. It is another difficult one, and it is, the listening experience is hard to analyze because it's very subjective. In terms of methodology, how have you negotiated this problem of subjectivity aside from the analysis of song lyrics, vocal timbre, accent, studio production techniques and effects, etc.?
Thank you for this one as well. I mean, I didn't get into my methodology very much. But as an ethnomusicologist, I'm drawing primarily on fieldwork and speaking with people. I mentioned sort of two unnamed interlocutors at the start. I wanted to protect their identities, but they are two younger people who kind of have quite well-developed ears. Neither one of them are musicians, but they both firmly believe in the presence and prosperity of traditional music. And when it comes to subjectivity, the more people that I interview, the more intersections that I find between the ways that musicians or I should say audience members are understanding these aesthetic qualities. So again, like a good ethnomusicologist, I am talking to as many people as I can, as well as kind of looking out online, for how people are advocating for a traditional music and sort of looking for those intersections of subjectivities rather than simply saying, here's one viewpoint and it's just one viewpoint.
Thank you, Alex. The next question is from Maggie Bottomer, who is faculty at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. She says, "Hi, Professor Cannon, great talk. Could you describe some more examples from the film Song Lắng about Southern Vietnamese culture? And could you talk a bit further about Cao Luong and its significance for Vietnamese culture?"
Sure. So Cải lương is a kind of music that emerged in the second and third decades of the 20th century. It emerged out of a Southern Vietnamese experience at kind of the intersection between sort of French cultural influence, this was during the colonial period, and Vietnamese music, particularly musicians who played đơn ca tài tử and other kinds of Southern Vietnamese traditional music. And so they were sort of experimenting with ways of kind of presenting Vietnamese culture that was deeply embedded in a Vietnamese everyday life and could tell stories about Vietnamese everyday life, get those stories onto the stage. Cải lương is extraordinarily important. It's a very rich genre of music. It was extraordinarily popular in the Republic of Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. It was very difficult to perform Cải lương in Ho Chi Minh City in the 70s and 80s, but became more popular into the 90s. But it also remains an extraordinarily popular kind of music among diasporic communities who continue to perform Cải lương outside of Vietnam and also listen to Cải lương performances in recordings as well as new performances that are going on. So, Cải lương is a really rich and old and powerful genre of music that people feel a real attachment to, and so it was very strategically deployed in Song Lắng, this movie. The movie sort of tells some of the difficulties of being a Cải lương performer in the 70s and 80s, but some of the sort of newfound hope that emerged in the 90s when Cải lương became more permissible on stage.
Thank you. And our next question is from Frank Prostjan, who is an independent scholar. 10 years ago at the Vietnam Museum of Ethnology, we were trying to find a title for a series of cultural performances. In English and French, the idea of, quote, "our living traditions," unquote, made perfect sense. But for the Vietnamese museum staff, the idea was nonsensical in the Vietnamese language. If a tradition was not always already living, it was not a tradition. A dead tradition was an impossibility. Is it not possible that in too quickly glossing the Vietnamese concept of tradition and modernity onto our categories, we're failing to listen to how Vietnamese themselves understand the vitality and continuity of tradition?
So yes, I mean, I kind of deployed these two concepts because they are sort of repeatedly deployed by musicians, audiences, and others on the ground. They are kind of identified as two different categories, although in the kind of practice of these musical traditions, they are not so easily separable. And this is not just specific to the Vietnamese case. These two concepts, as practiced in, whether it's Japanese music or Azeri music or elsewhere, the tradition and the modern are sort of firmly intertwined. And to some degree, that's what Ana Maria Chologote is saying in her orality text as well. But I will say that there are some people who do invoke the modern context as being quite different than the traditional one. I mean, the way that, let's say, the way that academics or Westerners, Euro-Americans invoke these two separate categories, that has been to some degree imprinted on Vietnam, not only through colonization, but in the periods later. So it's quite dynamic. There are people who kind of invoke differences between the two, but actually practice them as being sort of quite similar. And there are others who view them as entirely separate from one another. And so it's very difficult to kind of, actually, I shouldn't say it's difficult. It's very rich to try to understand the way that different people are using these concepts and what they actually mean when they use them. And I should say one other thing as well, the way that this is done linguistically in spoken language is different than what happens, say, in like a newspaper when sort of hiện đại or tin tông is written. I mean, there is kind of a clear distinction that's made in written language, but in spoken language, those things kind of blur together quite a lot.
Okay, our next question is from Nora Taylor from the Art Institute of Chicago, and she says, "Hi, Alex, fantastic talk. I was wondering if Suboy's rejection of Northern ideas about women and music has been criticized either by Northerners or the government."
Nora, thank you so much. Not that I know of, to be completely honest, although, I get the sense that Suboy is kind of embroiled in sort of, for lack of a word, battles with other artists, usually through their, through her and through their musical outputs. And indeed, there's, people are written up in the gossip pages in Vietnam as well. And so, I haven't found any sort of, really strong criticism of Suboy, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So, that's something that I can certainly, I can spend more time with the gossip pages, I guess. That would be, I think it's Joseph Roach who says that, we have to, that's how we learn about performance is through gossip. That's how we kind of move, keep ideas in play. So yeah, I should do a bit more work on that.
The torturous fieldwork of reading gossip.
Yes.
Okay. We have another question, or actually it's a comment from Hui Tam Thai, so you might want to respond to the comment, and that is the Southern accent is de rigueur for Thai Tu and Kai Luang music since they originated in the South. But the Southern accent is becoming more familiar in the North as some popular radio programs are produced in the South. Furthermore, Ho Chi Minh City is the site of artistic innovation.
Yes, I absolutely agree with this, and thank you so much for coming along to the talk, Professor Tai. And indeed, there is a history of having Kai Luang troops in the north, and there are some who advocate that there's a kind of Mien Bak, or sort of northern version of Kai Luang. And so, yes, I agree that the southern accent is becoming or is well known. But it is interesting when I listen to popular musicians that many who even hail from Hue or from the South, they still continue to use the sort of northern accent in order to disseminate their messages. So there is something to explore in the kind of greater prevalence of the southern dialect in popular music, but my understanding is that the northern is still fairly standard.
And I think that it might be a follow-up, but below it, there's something that's a Southern versus Northern musical traditions from Professor Tai.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. And the next question that we have is from Ngan Ha Tran, excuse my pronunciation, Faculty of Anthropology at BNU. Why did you choose Suboi as one of your case studies, but not a new traditional group by a young artist who plays traditional music in a new way in Vietnam?
I choose Suboi partly because I really like her work, and I think she's doing really interesting things with her sound. But certainly in a more extended version of this work, I should be looking at traditional musicians or musicians who are using traditional music in new ways, or who are developing the tradition in some way, because that is part of this argument as well. I sort of wanted to look at a couple of different examples, really quite contemporary and popular musicians who are invoking some elements of tradition. But then I can also be looking at traditional musicians who are engaging a bit more with the popular, in order to get a sense of this the nature of the spectrum between the tradition and the popular. Although I'm keeping Frank's comment in my mind that I shouldn't be sort of, establishing such, clear distinctions between the two, because they aren't so clear.
And that was the last question that we have in the question and answers that were typed out. I did want to ask you, based a little bit on what Mercedes had asked you, but also in general, to what extent are we to understand that regular, whatever that may constitute, regular Vietnamese people who are not educated in traditional Vietnamese music in the way that you are, and the people that you might have sought out during your fieldwork are, how educated are they in terms of aesthetics, in terms of being able to judge whether something belongs to a tradition, North or South, whether it's being done well or not well? Is that something, a kind of knowledge that many, many people have?
It's actually kind of it's a difficult question to answer, because there's a difference between, I think, what people will say and what they, and then sort of what they will say to me, and what they actually either think about themselves or the knowledge that they actually have. So to give you an example, there are many people who will say to me, oh, I don't know anything about Vietnamese musical traditions from the North or from the South or from the center. And therefore, I'm not qualified to evaluate this music. But actually, they have very well developed ears, because they have listened to this music for quite a long time. And so sometimes I have to work to kind of get around what people actually say to me. And I mean, again, I'm invoking the work of the ethnomusicologist, where you don't take everything just at face value. Someone might say, oh, I don't know anything, but they actually have very quite well-developed ears. Now, but they are still looking to learn more. I mean, I think that Song Lang, the film, taught many people a great deal about the Cải Lương tradition. Although I will say that, perhaps not everything was completely accurate in the Cải Lương, in that film, but such is the nature of producing a major film with quite well-known stars. You're not going to get exactly everything right, and you can't possibly do justice to a rich tradition in an hour-and-a-half film. But to kind of get back to your question, I think that people will say, I don't know that much, but actually they know a great deal more. There's also a difference between knowledge levels in sort of urban centers versus areas outside of urban centers. So in Ho Chi Minh City, for example, there are many young people that I've met who will say, I don't know anything. And when I press them, they're like, really, I don't know anything about this music at all, because I don't listen to it. I have no interest in it. Yeah, I'm not just not interested in it. And I play and only listen to kind of Western pop. Whereas out in the countryside, you hear a lot more of these sounds in your everyday life versus the city.
Great, thank you. We did have a couple more questions pop up in the Q&A. Charles Luanga, who is faculty here at the University of Michigan in our ethno department, he says, thank you for such an excellent presentation, Dr. Cannon. Could you please speak a little more about how the search for sonic purification, in quotes, along Anna Maria's conception of the notion presents as a potential site of listening experience? Thank you.
The search for sonic purification. This is a great question, because this is happening in some of the same ways that Otto Gautier talks about. This idea that we somehow need to teach people to sort of speak and act and play music in particular ways, and educational institutions do this. Major traditional musicians will try to do this to kind of purify the tradition in particular ways, and will seek for, we'll sort of seek out that particular pure tradition that we can kind of carry forward. And there are sort of good and bad things about that. I mean, going back to what I mentioned about that sort of unnamed senior scholar I invoked at the start of my talk, who is invoking homogenous traditions. There is that kind of sonic purification that's going on there. And some will advocate that is actually how you get people on board with traditional music, and it's how you preserve it. You kind of move away from that heterogeneous, multiple factions kind of listening experience and move to a more homogenous and pure one. And that's how you preserve it, and that's how you maintain it. But that's sort of my off the cuff response to that. It's really, again, thanks for such a good question. That's something I'll have to think about a bit more.
Fantastic. Judith Henty says, thanks for a great talk. Can you talk more about the medium of transmission of these different musical forms and the extent to which they are commercial?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Judith, for that great question. Transmission these days is primarily done through mediums like there's sort of certain local ways of disseminating and distributing music online. YouTube is used a great deal. There is still some commercialization, especially in popular music, but these days, because of the pandemic, which has also affected Vietnam, there's a lot of things that are just done with people's mobile phones and are uploaded to YouTube or Zing or elsewhere, and things are also passed via WeChat. And so, there is more work to do on kind of discovering or understanding, I should say, some of these new networks that are emergent outside of kind of commercial bases.
And then Frank Proschen had another follow-up from my question. For oral poetry, he says, there are kinds of listening circles among reciters, audiences. How much does Dong Ka Tai Tu function as a listening circle to develop a similar kind of connoisseurship?
Yeah, so, there are quite clear differences between the way that Gachu or one of the sort of vocal genres from the north, the way that is disseminated, and there's also a kind of audience engagement that happens in Gachu, where a member of the audience will provide commentary via a drum to the vocalists who are performing. Nâng Ca Tai Tu also can have a kind of listening circle, but in a different way. So, if you have a group of 10 people who get together to listen to Nâng Ca Tai Tu together, they will, not all of them will participate in every song. Some people will listen a bit more, other people will play, but they're all kind of actively taking part in the music making, whether they're just there or whether they're playing sound. But there are also sort of new ways that listening circles are starting to emerge. So Facebook is being used a great deal now to sort of beam out or disseminate ad hoc performances that are taking place in quite rural areas of southern Vietnam. So the listening circle is becoming kind of transnational. where I can be here in Birmingham, and I get a notification on my phone that one of my friends is going live in 2 minutes on Facebook to sort of disseminate a performance. Just he is together with his buddies, and they're drinking beer and having a good time, and they sort of disseminate to the world. And all of a sudden, I can become part of that listening circle. It's more difficult for me to contribute in the same ways that I would be able to do if I were on the ground, but I can still comment. And even just, hitting a little, hitting the heart or hitting the like button, up it goes in the Facebook feed, and they will react to that. Oh, we got a like from someone who's on the other side of the world. So yeah, there are sort of new ways that the connoisseurship is starting to emerge.
And the last comment that we have in the question and answer box is some food for thought. Maybe you have some thoughts on it already. From Kathy Lam, Individual Vietnamese American NGO Network. Maybe in the outside of the urban area, we are more attuned to the sound of nature, hence transpire into the sound for musicians.
Yes. Hi, Kathy. Thanks for coming. Yes, absolutely. I mean, in the Mekong Delta, it's a very different soundscape. And this is something that I am, now starting to explore in a bit more detail, how sounds of nature work their way into performances of music, not only traditional, but also popular, and how those differences create kind of new factions or new understandings of musical tradition compared to urban centers. And this also, I think, gets back to Professor Tai's comment from earlier, sort of, i.e. the differences between Northern and Southern traditions. They come from different soundscapes. The environment sounds different. Whether that's linguistic or a natural environment. And so that enables the emergence of different kinds of traditions that use different kinds of sounds. So absolutely, nature is certainly a fundamental part of this. And I'll say too, and I know this is, this is sort of near and dear to your heart, Kathy, the traditional music draws upon the sounds of nature, and with increased climate change and the impacts of climate change, sounds of nature are starting to differ or change, and that's impacting the way that traditional music and other kinds of music are developing in the Mekong Delta. So there's also something to be studied there as well.
And we have faculty at University of Michigan, Hugh Fung, who asks, well, first she says, thanks for your great talk, Dr. Cannon. If I may ask, can you explain a bit more about the connections or disconnections between the music and lyrics in the kind of music you're studying? Is it correct that traditional music like Dongka Tai Tu can affect the listeners more via lyrics, while the modern music like Savoy would engage the common listeners more via music?
Yes, I mean that's a great question, and certainly something that that's something that I've explored a little bit, but certainly warrants a great deal more. I mean, in my talk, I did advocate for the sonic experience as being, in some ways, the more important one, but I didn't mean to sort of diminish the potency and power of the lyrical content. I mean, in Tai Tu Miet Yuen, we see singers up on stage, and the commentary that's being received from the panel of judges is mostly about the lyrics, because that's what the performer is producing. Although there is a melody that goes along with it, and that melody is also important, and the judges also comment on the melody as well. Concerning sort of the connections or disconnections, I mean, sometimes there are disconnections that emerge between music and lyrics, and they've been studied to a certain degree. I mean, Philip Taylor a number of years ago wrote about some of the attempts to use or to add patriotic lyrics to really sad Southern Vietnamese songs, and how it just didn't work for anybody. Because you can't have sad sound and really sort of inspirational, patriotic, lyrical content. It doesn't align that well. But there is a great deal of commentary that can emerge from kind of disconnected lyrical content, i.e. lyrics that are saying one thing and the sound is saying something different. It can indicate potentially that, maybe a singer doesn't quite know what they're doing, or it can indicate the singer knows exactly what they're doing. They're trying to generate social commentary by singing about one thing when the sounds are slightly different.
Inderjit Kaur, who is faculty here at the University of Michigan, would love to talk to you sometime about listening and listening circles. We do have another question, though, after that from Nguyen Luong, which is, appreciate this session immensely because it educates me about Kai Luong's origin and is a form of traditional art. Many Vietnamese consider Kai Luong as K. Alex, you can.
Quay, yeah.
And why is that?
I think because there's this idea that Kai Luong is somehow, it's old, it's traditional, it belongs out in the countryside. It's part of Quay, Mian Quay. It's of your sort of hometown. It's something that you just kind of do with your family or with your friends, and it's not sort of modern and contemporary. Why people consider Kai Luong's way? I mean, it's potentially because it's a gloss for traditionality, and in many ways, for some people, it kind of looks and sounds old. If you look at performances of Kai Luong, some performances involve a particular kind of or a particular style of dress that has its origins in particular kinds of Chinese opera. And so, that's a kind of indicator of an old way of living or an old way of engaging with society. And the sounds are, emergent. The sounds of Kai Luong are emergent out of people's everyday experiences. And those everyday experiences oftentimes are in Mian Quay, are in the countryside, are in sort of back in the hometown. And so when you hear them again, it's like, oh, when I hear this, like it reminds me of the countryside, it reminds me of back home, because that place, that the nature and the way people lived is connected to that music. And so that's where the association emerges.
Great, and that is the end of our questions and also brings us to around the ending time usually of the lectures for C's. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming today, and I'd especially like to thank Dr. Alexander Cannon for his vital and intellectually interesting talk. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.